He's an economist, a historian, a philosopher, and one of the greatest social theorists America has ever produced. In a career spanning 6 decades, he's published more than 40 books and written thousands of newspaper columns on topics ranging from economic history and political philosophy to social inequality, education, and race. His name is Thomas Sowell, and he might be the most important scholar you've never heard of. Born during the Great Depression in rural North Carolina, in a home with no electricity, Sowell was orphaned when he was just a toddler. Taken in by a distant relative, he grew up in New York City's Harlem neighborhood. An unruly teen, he was obviously intelligent and obviously full of anger. The latter initially overwhelmed the former. He dropped out of high school, left home at age 17, and lived in a shelter for homeless boys, where he kept a knife under his pillow at night for protection. The Marines saved him. It wasn't by choice. He was drafted during the Korean War. In the military, he gained habits of personal discipline and developed self-control. He taught pistol shooting and learned photography, which became a lifelong hobby. After leaving the Marines, he went to college on the GI Bill, eventually graduating from Harvard and doing additional studies at the University of Chicago under the guidance of the legendary economist Milton Friedman. He began his intellectual journey as a committed Marxist, but soon reached a life-altering conclusion. Marxism didn't work. After studying the effects of various government regulations, including minimum wage laws, he concluded that free markets were a far better alternative, particularly for disadvantaged groups. Many attempts at redistributing wealth, he later wrote, have ended up redistributing poverty. In the 1960s and 70s, Sowell taught economics at Amherst, Cornell, and UCLA, distinguishing himself as one of the country's top experts on economic history. Since 1980, he's been a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. It was around this time that Sowell turned his attention to social theory and political philosophy, writing books like Knowledge and Decisions and A Conflict of Visions, which many consider to be his best professional work. He also began writing more about racial controversies, which is why he's not as well known and appreciated today as he should be. Sowell has been a vocal critic of civil rights leaders and of liberalism's misguided efforts to help the black poor. His targets over the decades have included welfare programs, racial preferences, multiculturalism, and opposition to school choice. Sowell brings the same empirical approach to writing about social policy that he brings to writing about economics. His focus is on the facts and the evidence. The actual results of a policy matter much more to him than the good intentions of politicians and policymakers. This is perfectly captured in his concept of stage one thinking. Liberal politicians propose expensive policy solutions and never ask the only questions that really matter. What are the long-term costs and consequences? In other words, what happens beyond stage one? By the time these costs and consequences fully manifest themselves, and they're usually disastrous, the politicians who originally set the policies in motion are long gone. They've derived all the political benefit and paid none of the cost. In books like Race and Culture, Sowell has demonstrated racial preferences are counterproductive, that political power is not necessary to advance economically, and that racial discrimination cannot be used as a blanket explanation for disparities in employment, education, and income. He's also shown how a racial or ethnic group's self-development, acquiring certain attitudes and behaviors, has far more bearing on economic advancement than how a group is treated by society at large. The Chinese in Malaysia and the Jews in Eastern Europe are among many examples of minority groups who have risen economically, despite being the targets of bias and discrimination. To those who use racism as an all-purpose explanation for racial inequality, Sowell's views have made him a pariah. Unable to counter his rigorous, evidence-based scholarship, left-leaning intellectuals, political activists, and mainstream media prefer to ignore him. That's why so many people today are aware of names like Ta-Nehisi Coates, Ibram X. Kendi, and Cornel West, but not Thomas Sowell. To say that Sowell has not had the impact he should is not the same as saying he has not had a profound impact on the thinking of a vast number of people. A fan account on Twitter has more than 700,000 followers. Videos of him on YouTube have millions of views. Mention his name to any conservative, and you'll hear Soul spoken of in reverential terms. Indeed, he matters today more than ever. That's because we're still debating topics he's written volumes about, like social justice, slavery reparations, and critical race theory. And Soul matters because he's that rarest of species, a brave and honest intellectual. We need 100 more just like him. I'm Jason Riley, Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute and author of Maverick, a biography of Thomas Sowell, for Prager University.
Who is John Galt? This is one of the most famous questions in modern literature. Even today, over 50 years after it was written, you'll hear people asking it. Why? Because it recalls the riveting suspense story, heroic characters, and powerful ideas portrayed in the best-selling novel Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. Born in St. Petersburg, Russia on February 2, 1905, Rand became one of the most celebrated authors and philosophers of the 20th century. Her most famous novels, The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, still sell hundreds of thousands of copies every year around the world. Rand lived through the early years of the Russian Revolution, saw her father's pharmacy business confiscated by the Bolsheviks, and experienced the horrors of communism firsthand. She longed to emigrate to America. In 1926, she did, and never looked back. To Rand, the United States meant freedom. She saw the Founding Fathers as heroes. They created a country based on individual rights, man's right to his own life, to his own liberty, to the pursuit of his own happiness, she said, means that every individual has a right to exist for his own sake, neither sacrificing himself to others, nor sacrificing others to himself, nor to the government. The practical results of the American system, Rand said, could be seen in the skyline of New York City. America's skyscrapers, she noted, were not built by public funds nor for a public purpose. They were built by the energy, initiative, and wealth of private individuals for personal profit. And instead of impoverishing the people, these skyscrapers, as they rose higher and higher, kept raising the people's standard of living. Rand advocated pure capitalism, which she described as a system in which the government acts only as a policeman that protects men's rights. No bailouts, no special favors for big business, no government intervention into the economy. When people are free to produce and trade, and when the government is limited to protecting rights, everyone benefits. Individuals thrive, societies prosper. How do we know this? Compare freer, more capitalist societies to less free, more statist ones. In Rand's day, America compared to the Soviet Union, West Germany to East Germany, more recently, South Korea to North Korea, Colombia to Venezuela. Such differences were painfully obvious to Rand. So were their causes. In Atlas Shrugged, she showed how easily a free society can collapse into a dictatorship. The heroine, Dagny Taggart, works tirelessly and brilliantly to save her family's railroad business, while ever-increasing government interventions destroy businesses and crush the economy. Meanwhile, one by one, the top producers across various industries mysteriously disappear. No one knows where they have gone. The only clue is a question they leave behind. Who is John Galt? As the economy crumbles, how do politicians, bureaucrats, and academics react? They blame the greedy businessman and decry the profit motive and free markets. Their solution? More government intervention, which of course only makes the problem worse. Sound familiar? Atlas Shrugged is a cautionary tale about pursuing equality over excellence, state control over free markets, but it's also about the power of the individual and the power of reason. The individual's reason in mind, Rand argued, is his tool of knowledge, his only means of understanding what is true or false, how the world works, what is good or bad for his life. This is the theme of Rand's work more broadly. In order to thrive, to achieve happiness, the individual must think for himself and live by the judgment of his own mind. To do this, people must be free, free to voluntarily exchange ideas, goods, and services for mutual benefit, free to speak their minds without fear. For this, she regarded capitalism not only as the best, but as the only moral social system. Capitalism does not tell man to suffer, but to pursue enjoyment and achievement, she argued. Capitalism does not preach passivity, humility, resignation, but independence, self-confidence, self-reliance. Above all, Rand emphasized, capitalism does not permit anyone to expect or demand the unearned. Is this the system America lives under now? No, said Rand. She called capitalism the unknown ideal because it has never been fully implemented, even in America. Ayn Rand's ideas on capitalism, individualism, and reason have attracted millions of people to her novels, essays, and lectures, and still do. Who is John Galt? I'm Gloria Alvarez with the Objective Standard Institute for Prager University.
It would only be a slight exaggeration to say that Alexander Hamilton invented the United States of America. George Washington was the guiding star, Thomas Jefferson the visionary, Benjamin Franklin the sage. But Hamilton was the pragmatist, the man who got it done. This most self-made of self-made men took a country with no past and planned its future. He was born on January 11th, 1755, on the island of Nevis. This was not the Caribbean of your cruise fantasy, quite the contrary. As Ron Chernow writes in his biography of Hamilton, while other founding fathers were reared in tidy New England villages or cosseted on baronial Virginia estates, Hamilton grew up in a tropical hellhole. Sugar plantation slave auctions were a regular feature of island life. The spectacle, buyers swinging branding irons as they surveyed the human merchandise, made a permanent impression on Hamilton. He was a fierce abolitionist his entire life. Abandoned by his father at an early age, his mother died of yellow fever when he was 14, leaving the teenage boy destitute. A local judge had to buy him shoes so that he could attend her funeral. He soon took a job as a clerk for a local merchant. Before long, he was running the business, coordinating shipments of mules and codfish, calculating currency exchanges, and advising sea captains on how to deal with pirates. It was an unmatchable apprenticeship in trade, credit, and commerce. In 1773, he arrived in New York to attend King's College, the forerunner of today's Columbia University. Swept up in the revolutionary fervor of his adopted country, he dropped out to join the Continental Army. He quickly came to the attention of George Washington, who made him a staff officer. The sonless Washington called the fatherless Hamilton, "my boy." Fellow officers later remembered, "Call Colonel Hamilton," as Washington's instinctive utterance when important news arrived. As Washington's trusted aide, he was involved in every aspect of running the war, including actual fighting where he distinguished himself on multiple occasions. But more than anything, it was his dealings with the weak and indecisive Continental Congress that shaped his political views. The problem with Congress, in Hamilton's view, was that too few members took the idea of nationhood seriously. They quarreled over their narrow interests rather than uniting over the national interests. As the war was winding down, Hamilton laid out the choice before the country in a widely read 6-part essay. "We could become a noble and magnificent federal republic," he wrote, "closely linked in the pursuit of a common interest, or we could stumble ahead as a number of petty states with the appearance only of union." It was clear where Hamilton stood. The speed by which the United States became a unified nation with a cohesive federal government is largely a result of his tireless efforts before, during, and after the Constitutional Convention. Washington named Hamilton, still only 34, to be the first Secretary of the Treasury. He served in the post for almost 6 years. His task was nothing short of Herculean: put the country drowning in war debt and teetering on the edge of bankruptcy on a sound financial footing. He succeeded, and in doing so set the course for America to become the world's most prosperous nation. Historian Leonard White writes that Hamilton was not only the greatest administrative genius of his generation, but one of the great administrators of all time. There's no telling what Hamilton might have achieved had he lived a longer life. Instead, he died one of the most pointless deaths in American history. As hard as it is to fathom today, he was killed in a duel with the Vice President of the United States, Aaron Burr, a man with whom he had a long and bitter political feud. Hamilton fired his pistol harmlessly into the air. He never intended to kill Burr. To Hamilton, it was an affair of honor. But to Burr, it was something else. The vice president took careful aim, shot, and mortally wounded his rival, who spent some 30 hours in agony before succumbing. Hamilton was 49. Hamilton lived in a time when the great danger to the national project was a government that was too weak. We live in a time when many believe that the great danger to the nation is from a national government grown too strong. The ideal, Hamilton would have told us, is somewhere in between. But perhaps America will have to wait for another Hamilton to achieve that happy medium. I'm Joseph Tartakovsky, Senior Fellow at the Claremont Institute for Prager University.
He was one of the most revered Americans of the 19th century. His story of personal triumph, humble origins to national prominence, is equal to or greater than that of Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, or Ulysses Grant. He never became a politician, but he spoke to presidents as an equal. His name is Frederick Douglass. Born a slave, Douglass never knew the exact date of his birth, never knew his father, never saw his mother after the age of 7. This wasn't uncommon at the time. Slave owners often made a point of separating families. Breaking family bonds increased dependence on the slave owner. Discipline was maintained through simple fear and destroying self-esteem. A slave could be punished for not working hard enough, but also for working too hard, or even for suggesting labor-saving ideas. Douglass experienced all of this and rebelled against it. As a teenager, he taught himself to read. This created a desire for freedom. When his owner discovered this disturbing development, he sent him to live with a local farmer, Edward Covey, who made extra money breaking the will of unruly slaves. Covey beat Douglass every week for 6 months, often for no reason. And it worked. Soon young Frederick gave up all hope of being free. "The dark night of slavery closed in upon me," he later wrote. That all changed one hot August day in 1835. When Covey struck him, Douglass fought back. Where he found the courage he couldn't say, the two men struggled until Covey stumbled away exhausted. Covey never laid a hand on Douglass again. The teenage slave had stood up for himself. He considered this the most important lesson of his life. Years later, he would tell this story when urging black men to enlist in the Union Army to fight the Confederacy. "You owe it to yourself," he said. "You will stand more erect and be less liable to insult. You will be defending your own liberty, honor, manhood, and self-respect." Douglass made his escape from slavery in 1838, slipping into the North disguised as a U.S. Navy sailor. At any point along the rail journey, his flimsy cover could have been blown. Displaying a confidence he didn't actually feel, he bluffed his way past suspicious conductors and runaway slave hunters. Once in the North, he joined the radical abolitionist movement and was quickly recognized as a powerful speaker and writer. The movement's leader, William Lloyd Garrison, burned the Constitution at his July 4th speeches. In Garrison's view, it legally protected slavery and was therefore irredeemable. But Douglass came to reject that. He believed that the Constitution was fundamentally opposed to slavery. Interpreted as it ought to be interpreted, Douglass said, the Constitution is a glorious liberty document. Not surprisingly, Douglass was a strong supporter of the Republican Party, the new anti-slavery party, and of the Union cause in the Civil War. Initially, he had his doubts about Abraham Lincoln. He didn't think Lincoln was truly committed to ending slavery. But he warmed up to the great emancipator as the conflict wore on. Lincoln, on the other hand, always admired Douglass. "Here comes my friend Douglass," Lincoln said when he saw him at his second inaugural in 1865. The Union victory ended slavery, but as the Democratic Party reestablished itself in the South in the 1870s and 80s, a new kind of racial oppression arose in the form of Jim Crow laws and, even worse, widespread lynching. This was a bitter pill for Douglass to swallow, but he never gave up the struggle and spent the last 3 decades of his life agitating for civil rights. Freedom, he was fond of saying, depended on 3 boxes: the ballot box, the jury box, and the cartridge box. For Douglass, it was self-evident that Black Americans, as citizens, were entitled to full freedom and full legal protection. At a speech in 1893, when white hecklers began booing him, Douglass set his speech aside and spoke extemporaneously. "There is no Negro problem," he roared. "The problem is whether the American people have honesty enough, loyalty enough, honor enough, patriotism enough to live up to their own Constitution." He also believed that true liberty would only come for Black Americans, as it comes for anyone, when they took full responsibility for their own fate. Ultimately, hard work and education would secure Blacks the rights they deserved. There can be no independence without a large share of self-dependence. This virtue cannot be bestowed. It must be developed from within, he declared in his most popular lecture, appropriately titled Self-Made Men. Douglass defended equality and freedom until the day he died. Literally, he passed away in 1895 on his way to a political convention. He had well understood the deep prejudice that existed, but he never accepted it as an inherent part of American culture. "My cause," he wrote, "was and is that of the Black man, not because he is Black, but because he is a man." I'm Timothy Sandifer, author of Frederick Douglass, Self-Made Man, for Prager University.
Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. Have you ever heard that thrilling line? Do you even know who Paul Revere is? If you're under, say, 30, I'm going to guess that the answer to both of these questions might be no. This is a very serious problem, but it's not your fault. It's a serious problem because it means you've been cut off from one of our greatest American stories. And it's not your fault because no one bothered to teach you about this courageous man and the great American poet who made him famous. It seems professional educators decided that other topics were more important to your education. But they made a mistake, a big one. The story of Paul Revere is part of our heritage. It and countless other stories like it unite us as a distinct people with a shared noble past. They also inspire us and stir national pride. These are good things, vital to the future of the country. Without them, we're just 300 million different individuals living between Canada and Mexico. It wasn't always this way. In fact, not long ago, you couldn't have left high school without memorizing the line I quoted and many of the lines that follow. So let me right a wrong and tell you about 2 remarkable Americans who lived half a century apart, one a silversmith and one a poet, Paul Revere and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. By 1775, the American colonists and their British masters were on the verge of war. The flashpoint was Boston. It wasn't so much a matter of where the British would strike, but when. To give themselves some advance warning, the rebels created a team of couriers. One of them was a successful 40-year-old silversmith and engraver named Paul Revere. On the night of April 18th, 2 lanterns were lit in the tallest structure in the city, the Old North Church. This was the signal that the fateful moment had arrived. The British were coming. Revere rode out into the darkness to warn his compatriots to prepare for a fight. That fight came the next day in Lexington. The War of American Independence had begun. But in the decades following, history mostly forgot Paul Revere. After serving in the war, he had an extraordinary career as an early industrialist, building a significant business that survives to this day as Revere Copper. But when he died in 1818, his obituary made no mention of his daring ride. The only reason we still know of him is because of another crisis in American history, the Civil War. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow had been an ardent opponent of slavery, an abolitionist, from the time he was a young man. By 1860, he was America's most famous poet. An epic struggle was coming, one that would again determine the future of the nation. He anxiously wondered whether the people of the northern states would be up to the challenge that lay ahead. What might he do to inspire them? Longfellow remembered a story he'd read many years before about Revere's ride. He recreated it with consummate skill. As you read his glorious poem, you can almost hear the thundering hooves of the silversmith's horse. Published in a new magazine called The Atlantic Monthly in January 1861, his brilliant ballad was an immediate success. School children began memorizing and reciting it at annual Independence Day celebrations. In 1883, a 22-year-old sculptor, Cyrus Dallin, was commissioned to create a Paul Revere statue to stand in the plaza across from the Old North Church. It is still one of the most popular tourist sites in Boston. What is Longfellow's poem asking of us who hear it today? It is doing what all great art does. It calls us to think of ourselves as part of something larger, as part of something noble, beautiful, good, and true. The men like Paul Revere who fought in the American Revolution were not merely fighting for themselves and for their families, but for something far beyond that, for a new kind of nation. The men who fought to free the slaves in the Civil War renewed that promise. If we forget these brave men, we forget what they stood for, and therefore we will forget what America means. And just like an individual who's lost his memory no longer knows who he is, a nation or a people that loses its memory no longer knows who they are. Longfellow's poem reminds us. So go read Paul Revere's Ride by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. I promise you'll be glad you did. It begins like this. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. I'm Eric Metaxas, author of If You Can Keep It, The Forgotten Promise of American Liberty for Prager University.
If you think the world is a mess now, that just means you weren't around in the 1970s. In Britain, where I grew up, the low point was known as the Winter of Discontent, a line borrowed from Shakespeare's Richard III. The inflation rate in 1975 was 27%. The trains were always late, the payphones were always broken, nothing worked. Worst of all were the recurrent strikes. Strikes by coal miners, strikes by dockers, strikes by printers, strikes by refuse collectors, strikes even by gravediggers. It felt as if there was no way back. And then came Margaret Thatcher. Between May 1979, when she entered 10 Downing Street as Prime Minister, and November 1990, when she stepped down, she changed everything. Born on October the 13th, 1925, she was an improbable saviour. Nothing in her middle-class childhood suggested the future ahead of her. A diligent student, she got into Oxford as a chemistry major. She worked for a small plastics company after leaving college, but was rejected for a position at the British chemical giant ICI because, as the personnel report stated, this woman is headstrong, obstinate, and dangerously self-opinionated. She needed all three of those attributes when she entered the world of politics as a Conservative candidate in 1950. After several failures, she finally entered Parliament in 1959. For the next 2 decades, she steadily worked her way up through the party ranks. As early as 1975, Thatcher had come up with a wonderful line about the opposition Labour Party. They've got the usual socialist disease. They've run out of other people's money. This she contrasted memorably with what she called the British inheritance, a man's right to work as he will, to spend what he earns, to own property, to have the state as servant and not as master. This was the essence of Thatcherism, and it was just the tonic that the patient, the British economy needed. It's fashionable nowadays to argue that there was no Thatcher miracle in the 1980s. Not only is that demonstrably false, it misses an essential point. Thatcherism wasn't just about raising productivity or creating jobs. Just as important was the goal of defeating inflation and restoring prosperity to the middle class. This it emphatically achieved. Yet the event that more than any other defined Margaret Thatcher's premiership was not economic, but military. The Falklands War against Argentina established her irrevocably in the public mind as the new Britannia, a warrior queen who gloried in victory. And of course it ensured a Conservative win in the 1983 election. There's no question that sending the Royal Navy Task Force to the South Atlantic took great political courage. Many in her own party pushed for a negotiated settlement. But the lady was not for turning, not because she was nostalgic for the days of empire, but because the invasion was to her mind morally and legally wrong. Not without reason did a Soviet magazine nickname Thatcher the Iron Lady. Along with her ideological soulmate, US President Ronald Reagan, she was unhesitating in her opposition to the Soviet Union. When the Soviets deployed intermediate-range nuclear missiles in Eastern Europe, she fully supported, despite fierce opposition, Reagan's countermove to send American cruise and Pershing missiles to Western Europe. It's still terribly hard for those who opposed her to admit it, but Margaret Thatcher was right about most things. She was right that the British trade unions had become much too powerful. She was right that inefficient nationalised industries had to be privatised. And she was right that the West could win the Cold War. "I can't bear Britain in decline," she told a BBC interviewer in April 1979. "I just can't." Nor could we. For much of the 1970s, that decline had looked irreversible. Yet Margaret Thatcher stopped the rot. She cured the economy of the disease of inflation and industrial unrest. She revived the idea of a property-owning democracy. And with her courageous and principled foreign policy, she restored Britain's standing in the world. Those of us who stood by her are entitled to feel proud that we were on history's winning side. But we should have no illusions about the humble, supporting roles we played. She was the leader, proof that sometimes it really is a single individual who can change the course of history. In Margaret Thatcher's case, decidedly for the better. I'm Neil Ferguson, Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford for Prager University.
Ideas have consequences, sometimes good, sometimes bad, and sometimes catastrophic, like the ideas of Karl Marx. Born in Trier, Germany in 1818, Marx didn't invent communism, but it was on his ideas that Lenin and Stalin built the Soviet Union, Mao built Communist China, and innumerable other tyrants, from the Kims in North Korea to the Castros in Cuba, built their communist regimes. Ultimately, those regimes and movements calling themselves Marxist murdered about 100 million people and enslaved more than 1 billion. Marx believed that workers, specifically those who did manual labor, were exploited by capitalists, the people who owned, as Marx put it, the means of production, specifically factories, but who did very little physical labor themselves. Only a workers' revolution, Marx wrote in Das Kapital, could correct this injustice. What would that revolution look like? Marx and his collaborator Friedrich Engels spelled it out point by point in the Communist Manifesto. It included the abolition of property and inheritance, and the centralization of credit, communication, and transport in the hands of the state, and a lot more along the same lines. In other words, the state owns and controls pretty much everything. This notion was widely discussed and debated in European intellectual circles during Marx's lifetime, but nothing much came of it until Vladimir Lenin took power in Russia in 1917. This changed everything. Despite its repeated economic failures, Lenin's Russia, which became known as the Soviet Union, became the model for dictators around the world. Wherever Marx's ideas were practiced, life got worse. Not by a little, but by a lot. There is not a single exception to this rule. Not the Soviet Union, not Eastern Europe, not China, not North Korea, Not Vietnam, not Cuba, not Venezuela, not Bolivia, not Zimbabwe. Wherever Marxism goes, economic collapse, terror, and famine follow. So, if cataclysmic failure, meaning terrible human suffering, is the inevitable legacy of Marxism, why do so many people, and now especially young people, defend it? The most common answer Marxism's advocates offer is that they, whoever they are, Lenin, Stalin, Chavez, never really practiced Marxism. They all somehow got it wrong. Marxism, we are told, is, at its essence, about sharing what we have, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, as Marx put it. Maybe that sounds good to you, but what does it mean? Who determines ability? Who determines need? The answer is the state, the ruling elite. Under Marxism, that's who has all the power. That's why the truth is this. Marxist dictators like Lenin, Mao, and Pol Pot really did get Marxism right. They wanted absolute power, and Marxism gave them the way to get it. Karl Marx never had to face the consequences of his theories. He lived most of his adult life breathing the free air of London, England, living off the generosity of his collaborator and patron, Engels, who, as it happens, inherited his money from his wealthy merchant father. Marx spent his days in the reading room of the British Museum, researching and writing. Although he was obsessed with the term scientific, he was never able to marshal data to prove his theories. There's a good reason for this. There was no data to prove his theories. For all his time in the library, Marx couldn't find any evidence to suggest that capitalism, the free exchange of goods and services through privately owned business, was a passing phase. Throughout the industrial age, working conditions constantly improved and wealth expanded. Marx had to rely on outdated reports to make his case, and even then he had to manipulate the data to get it to conform to his predetermined theories. But Marx really had no interest in proving his theories. He knew that they could be put into practice only by brute force. He said so himself. Of course, in the beginning, communism cannot be effected except by means of despotic inroads, he wrote. His ends could be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. All existing social conditions. That's religion, family, personal possessions, freedom, and democracy. They all had to go in order to achieve Marx's vision of an earthly paradise. But since few people give up their liberties and property voluntarily, creating a Marxist state has always required guns, prisons, and summary executions. Marx's many disciples from Lenin on never considered this a problem. Some, like revolutionary poster boy Che Guevara, considered it a bonus. "I don't need proof to execute a man," Che is said to have boasted. "I only need proof that it's necessary to execute him." If you're still a fan of Marxism after all the death, suffering, and destruction it's caused, that's your right. But own up to it. Don't hide behind the "it's never really been tried" line. It has. I'm Paul Kengor, professor of political science at Grove City College for Prager University.
When John Adams and Benjamin Franklin read Thomas Jefferson's draft of the Declaration of Independence, they undoubtedly recognized two things: Jefferson's peerless prose and the political wisdom of the 17th century English thinker John Locke. We still admire Jefferson's skill as a writer, but we have lost an appreciation for Jefferson's philosophical mentor. John Locke was born in 1632 in a small village in Somerset, England. He studied at Oxford to be a physician, but achieved fame as a political theorist. In 1690, he authored one of the most famous political tracts in history, two treatises of government. England had just gone through a period of great political turmoil, the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688, in which the Catholic king, James II, was overthrown and replaced by a Protestant one, William of Orange. The purpose of that revolution, which Locke supported, was not merely to substitute one king for another, but to move power away from the monarch and place it in the hands of the people and their elected representatives. The laws and liberties of this kingdom, in Locke's view, belonged to its citizens. This was, of course, how the American rebels saw their relationship with England. The Americans had no say in laws that the English crown and parliament were forcing on them. And, to put it mildly, they didn't like it. No taxation without representation was a classic expression of their displeasure. But how to frame the argument so that the whole world would understand it? Jefferson looked to Locke for inspiration and guidance. And using Locke helped in another way. How better, Jefferson calculated, to justify an American revolution than to use the arguments that were once used to justify an English one? So, what were those arguments? Locke posited 3. First, all men are created equal. Second, certain basic rights exist independent of government. Third, government exists to protect those rights. Let's take them in turn. Number 1, all men are created equal. Locke starts this argument at a very basic level, namely that human beings were created equal by God. We're all part of the same species, we're all capable of doing human things. In that sense, we are equal, not in qualities or outcome, but in rights. As John Locke wrote, creatures of the same species, born to all the same advantages of nature and the use of the same faculties, should also be equal without subordination or subjection. In this way, a king is in no way superior to a commoner, such that he might violate the commoner's rights. The king is a human being. The commoner is a human being. Each can reason. Therefore, one is equal to the other. We take this for granted now, but in 1690, it was a radical notion. Number 2, certain basic rights exist independent of government. Locke believed that it was man's natural state to be free. Therefore, freedom pre-exists government. That is, freedom came first, government came later. One hears this thinking expressed in Jefferson's famous phrase, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights." Here's how Locke put it. The natural state of man is to be free from any superior power on earth, and not to be under the will or legislative authority of a government. As rational human beings, Locke contended, we have the liberty, whether king or commoner, to think and act as we wish so long as we harm no one else. Number 3, government exists to protect those rights. For Locke, the purpose of government was to protect the individual's freedom and to protect the property, the land and material goods he lawfully acquired. The last thing Locke wanted was to give the government the power to take away that liberty or undermine those property rights. If government couldn't provide those protections, or if it abused its power, it didn't deserve to exist. The end of law, he wrote, is not to abolish or restrain freedom, but to preserve and enlarge freedom. Boiled down into a revolutionary slogan, we might summarize Locke's 3-pronged philosophy this way: don't tread on me. Can't get much more American than that. But today, Locke's ideas are under full-fledged assault. There are many Americans who believe that human beings are not created equal, that we should treat people differently based on their group identity. There are many Americans who believe that rights do not pre-exist government, that government is both our master and protector, granting and withdrawing privileges as it sees fit. And there are many Americans who believe that government should have almost unlimited power. Everything that Locke rejected, these Americans rush to embrace. Their preference for paternalistic government is not what Locke envisioned or what Jefferson described in the Declaration of Independence. We need to reintroduce John Locke and his ideas to a nation that has become increasingly blind to fundamental elements of its own history and character. Because if we lose Locke, we lose America. I'm Ben Shapiro for Prager University.
Imagine wearing a t-shirt, or displaying a poster, or waving a flag, emblazoned with the face of a brutal killer who openly expressed racist anger at blacks and indigenous people, and undisguised disgust for gays. Well, it's not something you have to imagine. It's done every day. Somewhere on a college campus or at a social justice protest, somebody is celebrating a psychopath. The famous face, of course, belongs to Ernesto Che Guevara. It's one of the most perverse jokes in modern life that so many people, especially young people, exalt him as a hero. Strange hero. He personally murdered or had murdered and personally tortured or had tortured thousands of Cuban citizens. He would have happily murdered and tortured many more if he had lived longer. The only thing that stopped him was a bullet. He was killed in 1967 at the age of 39, trying to organize a communist revolution in Bolivia. They say only the good die young. Che was an exception. But Che still captures the popular imagination. Why? Hell if I know. Unless you're into sadistic thug worship, I am at a loss. Maybe it's as simple as this. People don't really know anything about what Che actually did, only what they think he did. They think he was a handsome, sexy, hip, brainy revolutionary who sought freedom and equality for his people, a Hispanic Robin Hood, a martyr who sacrificed himself for others. In short, a tragic symbol of righteous rebellion. Except this is nonsense. The real Che was a murderous, homophobic, racist hypocrite. Yet Che flags are a feature at Black Lives Matter protests. Go figure. Here is Che on race. The black is indolent and a dreamer, spending his meager wage on frivolity or drink. Che explicitly stated that his vision of socialist utopia did not include blacks. We're going to do for blacks exactly what blacks did for the revolution, he said, by which I mean nothing. Or how about this? The blacks, those magnificent examples of the African race who have maintained their racial purity thanks to their lack of an affinity with bathing. If you want to cancel George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, what do you do with Che? The answer is you give him a pass. As the saying goes from the French Revolution, there are no enemies to the left. We see a similar confusion among the LGBTQ crowd. Che's face decorates many a pride poster and a rainbow t-shirt, and yet Che was an unapologetic homophobe. He called gay men perverts. He locked them up in camps and forced them to labor under a sign that read, "Work will make you men." In 2017, HuffPost published an article titled, "Are you gay? Che Guevara would have sent you to a concentration camp." The crusading humanitarian is not exactly checking the intersectional boxes, is he? Like a good Marxist, he claimed to despise luxuries and creature comforts, yet his Havana home was a vast mansion with a swimming pool, 7 bathrooms, a sauna, a massage room, a private yacht harbor, and 5 TVs. Not exactly an anti-materialist setup. Of course, he acquired this modest abode not by working for it, but at the end of a gun. In short, he stole it. This, according to Professor of Political Science Paul Kengor, is a perfect summation of communism in practice. The revolutionary leader has the bourgeois enemy of the state dispatched, appropriates his property in the name of the worker, and then claims it for himself. But of the things Che was, most of all, he was a liar. He lied about everything. He lied about being a doctor. He wasn't. There is no record that he ever graduated from medical school. He lied about being a military genius. He wasn't. He botched just about every military operation he ever led. He lied about knowing how to manage an economy. In fact, he trashed a growing Cuban economy during his brief span as Ministry of Industries. People have long forgotten that Cuba in the 1950s, before Fidel and Che took over, was one of the strongest economies in Latin America. According to a 1957 UN report, the average wage for an 8-hour day in Cuba is higher than for workers in Belgium, Denmark, France, and Germany. What may be worse than Che's endless lies about himself is that so many people lied for him. I'm talking about the left-leaning journalists, academics, and A-list Hollywood stars and directors. They are the ones who built up, marketed, and have perpetuated the constellation of falsehoods that surround the hate-filled revolutionary. Why did they do it? One simple reason. Because Che personifies anti-Americanism, hatred for the United States. That's what the Che obsession is really all about. So if you hate America, I guess Che is as good a symbol as any. But that says as much about you as it does about the psychopath you're celebrating. I'm Gloria Alvarez for Prager University.
I want to tell you about an American original. A man who saw into the future and made it a reality. Now, he isn't the only one to do this. There were American originals before him, Benjamin Franklin, the Wright brothers, John D. Rockefeller. And there are American originals in our time, like Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Elon Musk. But in the middle of the 20th century, there was no better example than Walt Disney. 50 years after his death, his name still stands atop a global empire. Raised on a small family farm in Missouri, Walt Disney arrived in Hollywood in 1923 with little more than a suitcase and a pencil. But he had something else, an idea. An idea to explore humanity's foibles through cartoon animals. Now, I know it sounds obvious now, but only because we live in a world that he helped create. At first, Disney, like most entrepreneurs, did everything himself. He wrote, produced, directed, and animated. And animation is a painstakingly time-intensive task. In the early days, it would take hundreds, if not thousands, of separate drawings to create a moving cartoon. But hard work was really never a problem for Walt Disney. Living on baked beans and renting a one-room office for $5 a month, he believed he was onto something, and nobody could convince him otherwise. And Disney would need every bit of that conviction. Now, though the barriers to entry in Hollywood in the 1920s were low, the competition was cutthroat. But a charming rodent and the coming of sound allowed him to break through. Steamboat Willie, in 1928, starring an early version of a whistling Mickey Mouse, confirmed Disney's belief that there was an audience, a very large audience, for what he wanted to produce. By 1933, Mickey was the biggest star in the world, and in that year alone, a cartoon mouse received 800,000 pieces of fan mail. Within a decade, Disney had transformed his one-person operation into a major studio employing 1,000 animators. But Disney was a restless personality. He was easily dissatisfied with his own success, and he wanted to make a full-length animated feature. It couldn't be good. It had to be great. It couldn't be in black and white. It had to be in color. And it couldn't just be in color. It had to be art in motion. It would be very expensive, far beyond what he had ever spent on a single project. But money didn't really interest him. It was only a means to an end. That end? Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. 3 years in the making. It was finally released in 1937, and it was an instant and phenomenal success, worth every dime spent, every heartache he had endured. Disney followed it with one artistic triumph after another: Pinocchio, Fantasia, Dumbo, Bambi. But by the late 40s, Disney's creative restlessness kicked in again. This time he had a new vision. He wanted to create a new kind of entertainment experience, not 2D, but a 3D world. He called it a theme park. And typically for Walt, it would be very, very expensive. But where was he going to get the money? Disney had a plan. He would trade his known quantity, his ability to engage an audience, for an unknown quantity, this crazy theme park idea. He approached the 3 television networks, NBC, CBS, and ABC, with this proposal. He'd create a live-action TV show. In exchange, they would give him the money to build this theme park. Well, CBS turned him down. It was too risky. NBC couldn't make up their own mind. But ABC, the youngest and the least successful of the 3 networks, desperately needed a hit. They said, yes, please. So with ABC's money, Disney built his park. Disneyland soon became another iconic Disney creation, the fantasy destination of every child on Earth. And that's as true today as it was when it opened in 1955. Men like Disney are rare, but far less so in America. Why? Well, because traditionally, Americans, unlike other people in other countries, don't rely on the government to get things done, and ideally, the government stays out of their way. Americans instead rely on their own ingenuity. In America, the only limit to your ambition is your own imagination. And if we want more American originals like Walt Disney, let's hope we keep it that way. I'm Glenn Beck for Prager University.